Frank Morrison had lost everything that mattered. His wife of 25 years had walked out, taking half his savings and all their shared dreams with her. The bank foreclosed on his house 3 months later. At 58 years old, he found himself sleeping in his van with only Max, his golden retriever, for company. Most men his age would have given up, sought a shelter, or called family for help. But Frank had spent his youth in the mountains, learning from his grandfather how to survive with nothing but grit and ingenuity. He drove his battered van deep into the remote wilderness of the Colorado Rockies. He found an abandoned mining claim and started to build. Using salvaged lumber, reclaimed metal, and stones from the mountainside, Frank and Max created something remarkable. Their simple shelter grew into a refuge that would eventually draw other broken souls seeking shelter from the storms of life. But what happened when winter arrived, and Frank faced his greatest test of survival? Before we get back to the story, let us know where you're listening from. And if this story moves you, make sure you're subscribed, because I have something very special in store for you tomorrow. The foreclosure notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a young man who couldn't meet Frank's gaze. 24 hours to vacate the premises. Frank stared at the official document, the bank's letterhead dancing before his eyes as the weight of finality set in his chest. 3 months earlier, Sarah had packed her clothes into matching suitcases, the same ones they'd used on their honeymoon in Yellowstone. She had stood in the kitchen, avoiding his eyes just like the delivery boy, and spoken the words that had echoed in Frank's mind every sleepless night since. "I can't do this anymore. Frank, we've become strangers living in the same house." The divorce papers arrived a week later. Sarah's lawyer, a sharp woman in an expensive suit, methodically dismantled 25 years of a shared life into columns of assets and liabilities. The construction business Frank had built from the ground up went to satisfy creditors. The house, their sanctuary with its carefully tended garden, and the workshop where Frank had built Emma's treehouse, became collateral damage in the financial ruin. Max padded over, sensing his master's anguish, and rested his golden head on Frank's knee. The warm weight of the dog was the only comfort Frank could find in those days. Sarah had wanted to take Max too, claiming he'd be better off in her new apartment across town, but Frank had fought it with a rare fury. Max had been his companion on long construction days, loyal in a way Frank was learning humans couldn't always be. "Just the two of us now, boy," Frank murmured, scratching behind Max's ears. The dog's tail thumped weakly against the hardwood floors Frank himself had installed, back when the future felt solid and predictable. Frank walked through the empty house one last time, his footsteps echoing in the rooms stripped of furniture and memories. The kitchen where Sarah had made pancakes on Sundays for 20 years. The living room where they had watched Emma take her first steps. The bedroom where they had planned dreams that would never come to pass. He had lost more than material possessions in the divorce. Frank's reputation in the tight-knit construction community had been damaged, as word spread about missed deadlines and abandoned projects during the worst of his personal crisis. Clients who'd trusted him for decades began calling other contractors. The work dried up just when he needed it most, to pay for legal fees and temporary housing. The van, a 2003 Ford with 180,000 miles and a tendency to overheat, was Frank's last mobile asset. He loaded it with essential tools, camping gear from better times, and Max's food and blanket. Everything else, furniture, photographs, Emma's childhood drawings, had been sold to pay debts or left for the bank to dispose of. Standing in the driveway of his former home, Frank pulled out his wallet, and removed the worn photograph tucked behind his driver's license. Emma, at 16, grinning beside the treehouse he'd built in the backyard oak. She lived in Seattle now, married, with her own mortgage and responsibilities. Frank hadn't told her the full extent of the divorce. He couldn't bear to burden her with his failures. The wedding ring Sarah had returned sat in the console's coin holder, a white gold band that caught the afternoon light. He'd worn it for 25 years, twisting it idly during difficult conversations or stressful moments. Now it felt alien, a relic of promises that hadn't withstood the pressures of life. Max whined softly from the passenger seat, his instincts detecting the emotional turmoil Frank was trying to contain. The dog had been remarkably adaptable, treating the van sleeping arrangement as one long camping trip rather than homelessness. His unwavering optimism was a quiet rebuke to Frank, who found it increasingly difficult to imagine a future beyond basic survival. Frank turned the key, listening as the engine rumbled to its familiar, rough idle. He had enough savings for maybe 2 months of cheap motel rooms, if he ate sparingly and avoided any mechanical emergencies. The practical part of his mind urged him to contact social services, explore shelter options, swallow his pride and ask Emma for temporary help. But another voice spoke louder. The voice of his grandfather, raspy with age and cigarettes, teaching a 12-year-old Frank how to read the mountain weather and build shelter from what the land provided. Those summer weeks in the Colorado wilderness had shaped Frank's understanding of what a man could accomplish with resolve and basic skills. Sometimes, his grandfather would say, as they built a lean-to from fallen timber, a man needs to step away from civilization to remember who he really is. Frank put the truck in gear, pointing it west, toward the mountains that had always represented freedom and possibility. Max settled onto the worn seat, trusting his human's judgment completely. Behind them, the foreclosure notice fluttered, taped to the front door of a house that no longer belonged to either of them. The compass had belonged to Frank's grandfather, its brass casing worn smooth by decades of use. Frank pulled it from his jacket pocket as the truck climbed the winding mountain road, the needle holding steady on north despite the vehicle's sputtering progress. His grandfather had used this same instrument to navigate the backcountry during his prospecting days, searching for silver deposits that had made other men rich, but had brought him only stories and scars. The Ford's temperature gauge crept slowly toward the red zone as they climbed higher into the Colorado Rockies. Frank eased his foot off the accelerator, nursing the aging engine through hairpin turns that revealed ever more spectacular views of pine-covered slopes and granite peaks. Max pressed his nose against the passenger window, breathing patterns of fog onto the glass as new scents filtered through the ventilation system. 3 hours out of Denver, Frank turned onto a dirt road that hadn't been maintained in years. Potholes jolted the van's worn suspension, and overhanging branches scraped against the roof like skeletal fingers. The road narrowed to little more than a track, before ending at a rusted gate marked with faded, "No trespassing" signs. Frank consulted the compass again, then the hand-drawn map his grandfather had sketched 40 years ago on the back of a cigarette pack. The mining claim was 2 miles further northeast, accessible only on foot through terrain that would challenge men half Frank's age. He shouldered the heavy pack filled with tools and supplies and clipped Max's leash to his collar. The afternoon sun filtered through the pine needles as they hiked upward, following game trails and Frank's fading memory of childhood visits. His grandfather had brought him here 3 times, teaching him to read the subtle signs of the land and to respect the wilderness that could either sustain or destroy an unprepared visitor. After an hour of steady climbing, Frank recognized the distinct rock formation his grandfather had called the Sentinel, a 20-foot granite spire that marked the approach to the old mining camp. Beyond it, a meadow opened up between the trees, showing evidence of human habitation from decades past. The original cabin had long since collapsed, leaving only a stone foundation and scattered timbers that time had bleached to the gray of old bones. A rusted ore cart lay tilted beside the foundation, its iron wheels frozen by corrosion. Further into the meadow, Frank found the entrance to the mine shaft, now sealed with concrete and posted with warnings about dangerous gases. But the site offered advantages his grandfather had chosen wisely. Fresh water flowed from a spring that fed a clear stream at the meadow's eastern edge. The surrounding lodgepole pines would provide both a windbreak and building materials. The altitude of roughly 8,000 feet meant cool summers and substantial winter snowpack, but also isolation from the complications of civilization. Max explored the meadow with growing excitement, his tail wagging as he investigated smells and sounds Frank couldn't detect. The dog seemed to approve of their destination, marking his territory with the confidence of a creature claiming a new home. Frank set down his pack and surveyed the remains of the ruined cabin. The stone foundation was still solid, built with local granite by men who understood that mountain weather demanded permanence. Some of the original timbers might still be usable after a proper inspection. The cabin's orientation had been chosen to maximize winter sun exposure and provide summer shade. As evening approached, Frank set up a temporary camp beside the old foundation. He pitched his small tent, gathered wood for a fire, and prepared a simple meal of canned beans and instant coffee. Max settled beside the fire, content to watch the flames dance while his owner planned their immediate future. The temperature dropped quickly once the sun disappeared behind the western peaks. Frank layered on more clothing and fed the fire, listening to the sounds of the wilderness that now soothed him where they once might have terrified. The call of a great horned owl echoed through the forest. Somewhere in the distance, a pack of coyotes announced their presence with wild harmonies that made Max's ears stand at attention. Frank opened his grandfather's compass again, watching the needle settle as he considered the magnitude of what he was attempting. To build a shelter from what the land provided, to establish reliable sources of food and water, to survive a high-altitude winter with minimal resources. His grandfather had done it during the Great Depression, driven by necessity and sustained by skills learned from his own father. The wedding ring glinted in the firelight as Frank twisted it idly, a habit that persisted despite everything. Tomorrow, he would begin to build something from nothing, creating shelter and purpose from the rubble of his former life. The mountain would test his resolve and his skills, but Frank felt something he hadn't experienced in months. A flicker of hope, laced with resolve. Max nudged closer to the fire, his golden coat reflecting the flames. Together, they would face whatever the wilderness offered. They had already survived the hardest part, losing everything that had once defined them. The hammer had been left beside the ore cart, its hickory handle weathered but still solid. Frank hefted the tool, feeling its familiar weight in his calloused palm. 22 ounces of steel and wood, perfectly balanced for driving nails or breaking apart stubborn materials. Tools like this had built America, wielded by men who understood that honest work required reliable instruments. Frank spent his first full morning surveying the mine site, methodically cataloging resources with the practiced eye of a contractor assessing a new project. The collapsed cabin yielded several usable beams, their cores still sound despite the weathered surfaces. A pile of corrugated metal sheets, likely from an old storage shed, lay half-buried under decades of pine needles and debris. Most promising was the mine's equipment dump. The previous prospectors had abandoned valuable materials when silver prices crashed, and operations became unprofitable. Frank uncovered coils of heavy-gauge wire, sections of iron pipe, and even a small anvil that someone had deemed too heavy to haul back down the mountain. Each discovery felt like a gift from the ghosts of former inhabitants who had faced similar challenges in this unforgiving environment. The original cabin's foundation provided an excellent starting point. Frank cleared debris from the rectangular stone base, admiring the craftsmanship of the men who had built it without power tools or modern conveniences. The foundation measured roughly 12 by 16 feet, large enough for a basic shelter, yet small enough to heat efficiently during the winter months. Using the recovered hammer, Frank began to dismantle the collapsed roof structure. Each beam required careful inspection to determine which sections remained structurally sound. The wood, weathered by decades of mountain climate, had developed characteristics Frank had learned to read during his career in construction. He knew that surface fissures and wear often concealed a core that remained strong and sound. Max had appointed himself assistant, carrying smaller pieces of wood in his mouth and depositing them in organized piles. It was some canine organizational system that Frank couldn't decipher, but the dog's enthusiasm for the work lifted his spirits, reminding him that purposeful activity could restore meaning, even in desperate circumstances. By afternoon, Frank had sorted the usable timber from the debris destined for firewood. He had enough material to build a basic shelter against the north wall of the existing foundation. The structure wouldn't be elaborate, but it would provide protection from the rain and wind while he gathered resources for a more permanent dwelling. Frank positioned the first beam carefully, using his hammer to drive salvaged nails into pre-drilled holes. The rhythmic sound of metal striking metal echoed across the meadow, a declaration that human habitation was returning to this abandoned place. Each strike of the hammer was a defiance against the circumstances that had brought him here, proof that skilled hands could create order from chaos. The shelter's frame took shape, slowly but surely. Frank's muscles, weakened by months of inactivity during the divorce, protested the unfamiliar labor. His hands, once calloused from daily construction work, began to develop new blisters where the hammer's handle rubbed against the soft skin. But the physical discomfort felt cleansing after so many weeks of emotional numbness. By nightfall, Frank had erected the basic frame of his shelter. The lean-to would rest against the existing foundation wall, its sloped roof designed to shed rainwater away from the sleeping area. The next day, he would install the corrugated metal roofing and begin work on the walls that would provide a barrier against the wind. Frank cooked his second mountain dinner over the campfire, sharing a canned stew with Max as he reviewed the day's progress. The dog had adapted to the new routine with remarkable ease, seeming to understand that this remote meadow represented a home, not just a temporary campsite. His contentment reassured Frank that they had made the right choice. This isolation could be healing, not destructive. The temperature dropped quickly as the sun disappeared behind the western peaks. Frank carefully banked the fire, ensuring the embers would last through the night for a quick rekindling if needed. He checked the weather radio and learned the forecast called for clear skies for the next 3 days, perfect conditions for continuing his construction work. Lying in his sleeping bag beside the dying fire, Frank listened to the nocturnal sounds of the wilderness. Somewhere in the forest, an owl sent its haunting call into the darkness. The wind sighed through the pine boughs, a whisper that seemed to carry voices from the past. Perhaps they were the spirits of the old prospectors who had sought their fortunes in these mountains. Frank clutched the handle of his hammer as he drifted off to sleep, the solid weight of the tool providing a measure of comfort and security. The next day would bring new challenges and new opportunities for progress. His grandfather's compass pointed steadfastly north, but Frank's true direction lay ahead, toward whatever future he could build with determination, skill, and the simple tools that had never failed him. Frank carved the wooden spoon from a piece of aspen he found near the creek, using his grandfather's old knife to shape the bowl and handle with patient, deliberate strokes. The simple utensil represented more than convenience. It marked his transition from temporary camping to permanent living in the mountains. A man who carved his own utensils was a man who intended to stay. The arrival of October brought crisp mornings that warned of the approaching winter. Frank woke before dawn each day, his breath a white plume in the thin mountain air as he rekindled the campfire and brewed instant coffee in a battered aluminum pot. The makeshift shelter had proven adequate for the autumn weather, but Frank knew it needed substantial improvements before the snow began to fall in earnest. The corrugated metal roof was now secure, sloped to shed rain and eventual snow loads. Frank had reinforced the frame with additional support beams salvaged from the mine, creating a shelter that could withstand the heavy snows that mountain winters delivered. He chinked the gaps between the logs with a mixture of mud and moss, using techniques his grandfather had taught him during childhood camping trips. Max had developed hunting instincts Frank never knew the dog possessed. The golden retriever hunted squirrels and chipmunks with surprising success, contributing small game to the meals they shared. Frank cleaned and cooked Max's quarry over the fire, appreciating the protein that didn't come from a can or require money he no longer had. Frank's days fell into a pattern dictated by practical necessity. Morning hours were dedicated to gathering firewood, a task that demanded constant attention as winter drew closer. He had located several dead-standing trees within a reasonable hauling distance, but felling and bucking them required more energy than his aging body could easily supply. Each log had to be hauled back to the camp, split with a salvaged axe, and stacked under a cover to keep it dry. Afternoons were reserved for construction projects that would improve his chances of surviving the mountain winter. Frank had expanded the lean-to into a more substantial cabin, using techniques that balanced available materials with engineering requirements. The structure would win no architectural awards, but it would protect 2 lives through months of sub-zero temperatures and heavy snowfall. Water presented an ongoing challenge, despite the nearby creek. Frank needed reliable access to unfrozen water throughout the winter, which meant creating a system that could function even when the surface turned to ice. He began digging a well near the spring, hoping to reach groundwater that would remain liquid during the coldest months. Food storage required creative solutions to protect his supplies from weather and wildlife. Frank built an elevated cache on posts, sheathed with salvaged sheet metal, designed to keep bears and other scavengers out of his winter provisions. He began smoking fish caught from the creek, creating protein that would remain edible for months without refrigeration. The wooden spoon served its first meal, pine needle tea, brewed to prevent scurvy during the months when fresh vegetables would be unavailable. His grandfather had taught him to identify edible plants and prepare traditional remedies from the forest. The tea tasted bitter, but it contained the vitamin C that would maintain his health through the isolation of winter. Frank's body was adapting to the physical demands of mountain life. His hands had developed new calluses from the axe work and construction tasks. His shoulders broadened as the daily chopping of wood rebuilt the muscle mass he had lost during the months of depression following his divorce. More importantly, his mind found the focus that had been absent since Sarah had left. Every evening, Frank sat by the fire and carved wooden implements they would need to survive the winter. Spoons, bowls, and handles for various tools took shape under his patient knife work. The repetitive motions soothed his mind while producing useful objects from raw materials the forest provided, free of charge. Max had grown a thicker winter coat in response to the colder temperatures. His golden fur became dense enough to provide insulation during the frigid nights. The dog seemed to thrive in the wild environment, his natural instincts reawakening after years of suburban domestication. He learned to alert Frank to the approach of wild animals and developed an uncanny ability to predict changes in the weather hours before they occurred. Frank tested the balance and smooth finish of the completed spoon, satisfied with its functional beauty. These simple accomplishments held a weight that the expensive possessions of his former life had never provided. Each carved utensil, each improvement to his shelter, each successful hunt or foraged meal represented a victory over circumstances that had once seemed insurmountable. The first snow would arrive in a few weeks, but Frank no longer felt the panic that had driven him to the mountains. He had shelter, tools, skills, and most importantly, a purpose that sustained him through each challenging day. The wooden spoon would serve countless meals in the home he was building, from nothing but determination and the wisdom he remembered from his grandfather. The candle burned with a steady flame, defying the howling wind that threatened to destroy everything Frank had built. He had rendered it himself from the fat of a deer he'd managed to bring down the week before, mixing the tallow with a wick salvaged from an old emergency kit. The simple light source now meant the difference between hope and despair, as the worst storm he had ever faced raged against his mountain refuge. The snow had been falling for 36 straight hours, accumulating faster than Frank had imagined possible. What began as light flakes on Tuesday morning had intensified into a full-blown blizzard by Wednesday afternoon, with winds gusting over 60 miles per hour and visibility reduced to mere feet beyond the cabin's single window. The roof groaned ominously under the weight of the wet, heavy snow that continued to pile up. Frank had designed the structure to handle a normal mountain snowfall, but this storm exceeded all his calculations. Around midnight, he heard the sickening crack of overburdened timber, followed by a cascade of snow and debris as a section of the roof collapsed near the northeast corner of the cabin. Cold air poured through the breach like an Arctic river, plunging the interior temperature instantly below freezing. Frank scrambled to cover the opening with salvaged tarps and blankets, but the wind kept tearing his makeshift repairs apart. Snow swirled in through the opening, dusting everything with a fine powder that melted into icy puddles on the wooden floor. Max huddled against Frank's legs, shivering despite his thick winter coat. The dog's usual confidence had evaporated as the storm's fury intensified beyond anything either of them had ever experienced. Frank wrapped Max in his spare sleeping bag, creating a pocket of shared warmth while he fought to keep the fire going in the stone hearth. By Thursday morning, Frank knew they were in real danger. The gap in the roof had widened overnight, allowing more snow and wind to invade their shelter. The temperature inside the cabin hovered just above freezing, despite his constant efforts to feed the fire. Worse, his supply of dry firewood was running dangerously low. Frank's hands were numb at the fingertips, and he recognized the first signs of frostbite, thanks to his grandfather's warnings about mountain winters. If he couldn't restore the cabin's integrity soon, hypothermia would become an immediate, life-threatening danger for them both. Working by the light of the single candle, Frank attempted emergency repairs, using materials scavenged from inside the cabin itself. He pried boards from his sleeping platform to patch the hole in the roof, securing them with rope and salvaged nails hammered home by numb fingers that barely responded to his commands. The work was slow, and the storm continued its relentless assault. The candle flame flickered as the wind found new gaps in his hasty repairs. Frank realized that this simple light represented more than illumination. It symbolized life persisting against all odds. As long as the candle burned, hope remained alive, despite the chaos surrounding them. The warmth of Max at his back provided crucial body heat during the coldest pre-dawn hours. The dog's loyalty and trust humbled Frank, who understood that his own decisions had led them into this life-or-death situation. If they died on this mountain, it would be because of his stubborn refusal to accept defeat and seek help from civilization. Friday's dawn revealed the storm's continuing fury. Snow had drifted against the cabin walls, reaching nearly to the roofline on the leeward side. His emergency repairs had held through the night, but just barely. He faced a crucial decision: try to make a run for his truck, parked miles away, or continue to fight for survival in his compromised shelter. The choice was made for him when he discovered the cabin door was completely blocked by the accumulated snow. They were effectively trapped until the storm broke and he could dig them out. Frank accepted the situation with the grim determination his grandfather had taught him. When you cannot change your circumstances, you adapt. He moved the candle to a central position where its meager warmth could provide the most benefit. He and Max huddled together in the sleeping bag, sharing body heat as they conserved energy for whatever challenges remained. The dog's steady breathing and warm presence reminded Frank that he wasn't facing this crisis alone. The storm raged for another day before finally exhausting itself. When silence at last returned to the mountain, Frank and Max had survived the worst ordeal either of them had ever faced. The candle had burned for 3 days and nights, its constant flame proving that simple determination could sustain life even when all else failed. As Frank dug them out of their snow-covered shelter, he felt a profound gratitude for the lessons his grandfather had taught him about survival and perseverance. The storm had tested all his skills, but they had endured. The mountain had shown its power, but they had proven worthy of its respect. The garden seeds had traveled in Frank's wallet since his last visit to the hardware store as a married man. Sarah had asked him to pick up tomato and bean seeds for their suburban garden, a domestic project they had planned in happier times. Now, 5 months later, Frank examined the small packets, marveling at how fate had preserved them for this moment, when he desperately needed hope for the future. Spring arrived tentatively in the high country, marked by subtle shifts that Frank had learned to read like a mountaineer's almanac. The snow melted first in the sun-drenched patches near the cabin, revealing brown turf that would soon turn green. The creek, frozen solid through the worst of winter, began to show patches of running water that sang with the music of the thaw finding its way downhill. Frank's shelter had suffered damage during the brutal winter, but the basic structure had held firm. He spent the first days of spring repairing the storm damage, replacing broken sections of the roof and reinforcing walls that had borne months of heavy snow loads. The work felt different now. No longer desperate measures for survival, but improvements to a home he intended to keep. Max emerged from the winter leaner, but with bright eyes that reflected his successful adaptation to mountain life. The dog had learned to hunt small game with remarkable skill, supplementing their diet with rabbits and ground squirrels captured through patient stalking. His golden coat had grown thicker and coarser, designed by nature to handle the extreme temperatures his suburban life had never demanded. Frank's garden occupied a south-facing slope where the snow melted earliest and the soil warmed quickly in the spring sun. He worked the earth with tools he improvised from salvaged materials, turning over soil that hadn't been cultivated since the original miners abandoned their claims decades before. The physical labor felt therapeutic after months of indoor confinement. Frank planted the seeds according to the printed instructions on packets that belonged to another life. Another man who had worried about property taxes and homeowners association rules. Now he worried about frost dates and soil drainage, concerns that connected him directly to the Earth's natural rhythms instead of bureaucratic abstractions. Each planted row was an act of faith in the future, a belief that he and Max would still be living here when the vegetables were mature enough to harvest. Frank had survived his first winter in the mountains, proof that his grandfather's lessons in wilderness survival held practical wisdom, not just nostalgic romanticism. The garden would provide fresh food and a sense of purpose through the coming growing season. Frank expanded the living space in late spring, adding a second room to the cabin that would serve as a workshop and storage area. The addition utilized techniques he had refined during the winter months, when he had ample time to plan improvements while blizzards raged outside. Each joint fit with precision. Each beam was positioned to handle its predicted load, with engineering knowledge gained from decades of construction work. The new room housed projects that kept Frank's hands busy during the evening hours. He carved furniture from deadfall, created tools from salvaged metal, and repaired equipment damaged by the harsh winter conditions. The work provided a satisfaction his old corporate construction projects rarely had, perhaps because every item he created served an immediate, practical need. Frank's physical condition had improved dramatically since the fall. The demands of winter had stripped away excess weight while building lean muscle in his arms and shoulders. His hands had developed new calluses specific to mountain tasks, splitting wood, working with hand tools, and handling rough materials without protective gloves. At 58, he felt stronger than he had in years. The isolation that had initially frightened Frank now felt comforting rather than oppressive. He woke each morning to a silence broken only by natural sounds, the song of birds, the wind in the trees, and the distant murmur of running water. No traffic noise, no neighborhood disputes, no constant electronic distractions that had filled his suburban existence with meaningless anxiety. Frank's mental state had stabilized into something resembling contentment. The desperate depression that had driven him to the mountains was replaced by a quiet satisfaction in each day's accomplishments. He slept soundly, without the sleeping pills that had become necessary during his divorce, waking naturally with the sunrise instead of battling alarm clock-jolted mornings. The garden seeds sprouted on nature's schedule, sending green shoots toward the sunlight with a determination that matched Frank's own emergence from his personal winter. Each plant represented hope, setting down roots in soil enriched by hardship and watered with honest sweat. The vegetables would feed his body, while the act of tending them continued to heal his spirit. As summer approached, Frank realized his mountain refuge had become a home in a way his suburban house never could. This place demanded everything he could give, while returning to him a sense of purpose, peace, and the profound satisfaction that comes from living by principles older and more reliable than modern convenience and consumer comfort. The torn backpack lay abandoned by the creek, its blue fabric faded, and one strap completely severed from the main body. Frank discovered it during his morning water collection, along with the scattered contents that told a story of desperate flight. Energy bar wrappers, a shattered cell phone, and clothes suited for someone much younger than himself. Max growled low in his throat, ears pricked forward, as he detected movement in the trees beyond the stream. Frank followed the dog's gaze to spot a figure crouched behind a fallen log, watching them with the weary intensity of a cornered animal. The boy, Frank could see now it was definitely a teenager, was thin to the point of being skeletal, with matted dark hair and clothes soiled from days of hard travel. "I know you're there," Frank called out, keeping his voice calm and non-threatening. "If you're hungry, you can have some breakfast." The boy remained still for several long minutes, clearly wrestling with the conflicting instincts of hunger and distrust. Frank continued his normal morning routine, stoking the fire and brewing coffee as if refugee teenagers appeared in his meadow every day. Sometimes the best way to earn trust is to show you aren't trying to force it. Finally, the boy stepped out from his hiding place with the cautious movements of someone who expected trouble. He was maybe 16 or 17, with intelligent brown eyes that knew far too much about the cruelties of adults. A purple bruise decorated his left cheek, and Frank noted how he favored his right arm, suggesting a recent injury. "I'm Frank," he said, offering a cup of coffee without making any sudden moves. "This is Max. We've been living here for about 8 months." "Jake," the boy replied after a long pause. His voice held the trace of an accent Frank couldn't immediately place. "I wasn't stealing anything. Just needed water." "Water's free. So is food, if you're interested." Frank stirred the pot of oatmeal he'd been cooking, adding extra portions without drawing attention to the gesture. "When's the last time you had a real meal?" Jake's stomach answered before he could, rumbling loud enough to make Max's ears twitch with interest. The boy's face flushed with shame, but he accepted the bowl Frank offered with hands that trembled slightly from exhaustion or hunger. Frank waited until Jake had consumed 2 full bowls before asking any questions. He had learned patience during his months of solitude, understanding that rushed conversations usually prevented them from happening at all. The boy ate with the focused intensity of someone who wasn't sure when his next meal might appear. "Running from something, or running to something?" Frank finally asked, keeping his tone conversational rather than interrogative. Jake's hand tightened around the empty bowl. "Both, I guess. My stepfather has strong opinions about kids who don't follow his rules exactly. When those opinions involve his fists, it seemed like a good time to find somewhere else to be." Frank nodded, remembering his own teenage years, when his father's alcoholism had made home a dangerous place. "How long have you been in the mountains?" 3 days, maybe 4. It's hard to keep track when you spend most of the day hiding and walk at night." Jake's eyes scanned Frank's setup with the calculating gaze of someone weighing options. "This place yours?" "Doesn't officially belong to anyone. It's an old mining claim that was abandoned when the silver prices crashed. I've been fixing it up, making it livable." Frank gestured toward the cabin and garden that represented months of careful work. "There's room enough for one more if that one is willing to pull his own weight." Jake's expression shifted from weary to cautiously hopeful. "What kind of weight?" "Same things I do: gather firewood, tend the garden, help with construction projects, hunt and fish to supplement our food supply. Basic survival stuff that keeps us fed and warm." "I don't know much about any of that," Jake admitted. "I'm more of a city kid." "City kids can learn mountain skills if they're motivated. The question is whether you plan to stick around long enough to make it worth learning, or if you're just passing through on your way somewhere else." Jake looked around the meadow, taking in the peaceful isolation that had become Frank's sanctuary. "I don't have anywhere else to go. This seems better than dodging social workers and sleeping in bus stations." Max cautiously approached the boy, sniffing his outstretched hand before allowing a tentative pat. The dog's acceptance seemed to settle something in Jake's mind. as if earning canine approval was a major milestone in whatever decision-making process teenagers used. "I can try for a while," Jake said finally. "See if I can learn what you're willing to teach." The whittling knife had belonged to Frank's grandfather. Its carbon steel blade was razor sharp from decades of careful maintenance. Frank placed it in Jake's hands with the reverence due a family heirloom, watching the teenager test the tool's perfect balance and worn wooden handle. "First rule of carving," Frank said, sitting beside Jake on the split-log bench they'd built outside the cabin. "The knife controls the wood, but patience controls the knife. Rush the cuts, and you'll end up bleeding instead of creating." Jake turned the blade carefully in his hands, watching how the steel caught the morning sunlight. "What should I make?" "Start with a spoon. Simple shape, useful purpose, and forgiving enough that mistakes become character instead of flaws." Frank picked out a piece of aspen from the woodpile. Its grain was straight and free of knots that might catch the blade unexpectedly. "The wood wants to become something beautiful. Our job is to help it figure out what that is." 3 weeks had passed since Jake's arrival, and the boy had adapted to mountain life with surprising resilience. His initial clumsiness with basic chores had given way to a growing competence in splitting wood, tending the garden, and maintaining their various systems. More importantly, Jake had begun to lose the hyper-vigilant weariness that marked children who had learned to expect violence from adults. Frank demonstrated the first cuts, showing Jake how to brace the wood and control the blade's angle to remove material efficiently without gouging. "Feel the resistance. Good wood wants to be cut cleanly, but you have to work with the grain instead of fighting it." "Like people?" Jake observed, making his first hesitant cuts. The blade bit deeper than intended, leaving a ragged mark on the wood's surface. "Just like people. You're forcing it in directions it doesn't want to go, and you usually make things worse instead of better." Frank guided Jake's hands into a better grip. Gentle pressure lets the sharp blade do the work. Jake's second attempt produced cleaner cuts, shaving off thin slivers that curled from the blade like wooden ribbons. His face held the concentration Frank remembered from his own first carving lessons, when every slice required conscious thought rather than instinct. "Tell me about your stepfather," Frank said quietly, continuing his own work on a bowl he'd been shaping for several days. Jake's hands paused for a moment before resuming their careful cutting motion. "Derek thinks discipline means intimidation. When I was younger, it was mostly yelling and threats. He started getting physical when I got big enough to talk back." "Does your mother know?" "She knows. She just can't afford to lose another husband." Jake's voice carried the bitter understanding of adult economics and emotional compromises. "Derek has a good job, pays the bills, doesn't drink like my real dad did. She figures a few bruises are better than eviction notices." Frank nodded, acknowledging the impossible choices poverty forced on families. "Some situations don't have good solutions, just less bad ones. That's what I concluded. So I created my own." Jake studied the rough shape of the spoon, eyeing where a few more cuts might improve the design. Running away seemed better than waiting to see how much worse things could get. The afternoon passed in a comfortable rhythm of work. Both of them focused on their respective projects, sharing the quiet fellowship that grows between people engaged in similar tasks. Max dozed in the sun, occasionally lifting his head to monitor the forest sounds that might signal approaching wildlife. Frank watched Jake's technique improve with each careful cut, noting how the boy's natural intelligence applied itself to understanding the grain of the wood and the control of the knife. Teaching felt different from his days on the construction crew, where training workers focused on speed and productivity rather than patience and craftsmanship. "Jake," Frank said during a lull in their work, "why are you up here? I mean, it's obvious you know how to build things. You could probably get a construction job in town if you wanted." Frank considered how much of his own story to share with a teenager who had his own problems to solve. Sometimes a man needs to step away from everything familiar to find out who he really is, underneath all the expectations and disappointments. "Did you find out?" "Still working on it. But I know more about myself now than I did 8 months ago." Frank tested the smoothness of his bowl's interior with his thumb, feeling for rough spots that needed more attention. Mountain life strips away everything that isn't essential. What's left is either strong enough to build on or weak enough that you're better off without it. Jake held up his half-finished spoon, examining the crude but functional shape emerging from his patient work. "You think I'll ever get good at this?" "You're already better than you were this morning. Keep up that pace of improvement, and you'll surprise yourself with what you can accomplish." Frank smiled at the boy's growing confidence. Patience and practice could teach a person about anything worth knowing. The sheriff's badge glinted in the sunlight as Maria Santos emerged from the tree line. Her khaki uniform was more practical than intimidating, despite the service weapon holstered at her hip. Frank had heard her approach for the last 10 minutes. The crunch of boots on dry leaves, the static of a radio, the measured breathing of someone climbing at altitude. Max announced the visitor with a short bark before settling back into a watchful stillness. "Mr. Morrison." Sheriff Santos removed her hat, revealing graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her weathered face suggested someone who spent a lot of time outdoors, and her steady gaze assessed Frank's mountainside setup with professional thoroughness. "That's me," Frank replied, continuing to chop wood, keeping his movements calm and deliberate. Beside him, Jake had frozen solid, his knuckles white on the axe handle. "Can I help you with something, Sheriff?" "Got a report about squatters on public land. Figured I'd check it out myself rather than send deputies who might not understand the nuances of the situation." Her tone suggested experience with mountain folk and their complicated relationships with official authority. Frank set down his axe and faced the sheriff directly. "We're not causing trouble, damaging property, or bothering anyone. Just trying to live quietly and mind our own business." "I can see that." Sheriff Santos surveyed the tidy camp, noting the garden rows, the organized woodpile, and the well-maintained cabin. "You've put a lot of work into this place. How long have you been here?" "About 10 months. Found the old abandoned mining claim. Figured it wouldn't hurt anyone if we fixed it up a bit." Jake shifted nervously, clearly calculating escape routes despite Frank's calm demeanor. The sheriff's attention turned to the teenager. Her expression softened as she took in his defensive posture and the still visible bruise on his cheek. "And you, son? How long have you been up here?" Jake looked to Frank before answering. "Ma'am, Frank's been teaching me about mountain survival. Jake Parker." Sheriff Santos consulted a small notebook she pulled from her shirt pocket. "You were reported missing from Grand Junction about a month ago. Your folks are worried about you." "My stepfather is worried about losing his punching bag," Jake replied with bitter honesty. "My mother is worried about losing her meal ticket." Sheriff Santos closed the notebook, an expression on her face that suggested familiarity with domestic situations that defied easy solutions. "Son, I understand family situations can be complicated, but legally, you're still a minor. I'm obligated to ensure your safety and return you to your legal guardians, unless those guardians pose a threat to your well-being." Frank cut in smoothly. In which case, I believe you have discretion over immediate placement while social services investigates. The sheriff studied Frank with renewed interest. You seem to know a thing or two about legal procedure, Mr. Morrison. I went through a difficult divorce recently. Learned more about family law than I ever wanted to know. Frank kept his voice steady, offering information incrementally rather than defensively. Jake has been safe here, well-fed, and learning useful skills. If you need to involve social services, I understand. But I'd ask you to consider whether removing him from a stable situation is in his best interest. Sheriff Santos walked slowly through the camp, examining the water system, the food storage, and the condition of the shelter. Her assessment was thorough but not hostile, suggesting someone who understood the difference between dangerous squatting and harmless homesteading. You realize this land belongs to the Forest Service. Technically, you're trespassing on federal property. Yes, ma'am. We also realize that budgets don't allow rangers to patrol every abandoned mining claim in the national forest. We're not cutting live trees, polluting water sources, or creating fire hazards. We're probably doing more to maintain the area than it's seen in decades. It's a valid point. The sheriff accepted Frank's offer of coffee, seating herself on the log bench with the careful movements of someone whose joints had accumulated years of hard use. Tell me how this arrangement benefits everyone involved. Frank explained their daily routines, Jake's rapid learning of practical skills, and the peaceful coexistence they had established with the local wildlife. He emphasized Jake's transformation from an angry runaway into a contributing member of their small community, noting the boy's improved physical and emotional health. Sheriff, Jake said quietly, I know you have to do your job, but this is the first place I've ever felt safe. Frank doesn't yell, he doesn't hit. He doesn't make me walk on eggshells worried I'm going to set him off. I'm learning things here that can actually help me build a decent life. Sheriff Santos sipped her coffee thoughtfully, weighing official responsibilities against human considerations. Mr. Morrison, do you have any family references? People who can vouch for your character? My daughter lives in Seattle. My ex-wife could probably provide a reference, assuming she isn't still too angry to talk to me. Frank looked her straight in the eye. I'm not perfect, Sheriff, but I'm not dangerous. Jake is safer here than he was in his stepfather's house. It took Frank 3 days to carve the welcome sign, working by firelight after the daily chores were done. He shaped it from a piece of pine that had naturally seasoned for decades, its grain tight enough to resist the mountain weather while still accepting the detailed work of his grandfather's knife. The words Mountain Haven emerged from patient cuts, the letters deep enough to remain legible for years to come. Somehow, word had gotten out about Frank's mountain refuge, despite its isolation. Jake suspected social media posts from hikers they'd encountered on trips to town for supplies. Frank didn't understand how any of that worked. Regardless of the source, the second visitor arrived on a Tuesday morning, carrying everything he owned in a garbage bag and walking with the careful gait of someone whose feet ached. Name's Walter, the newcomer announced, sitting heavily on the log bench without being invited. He was maybe 65, with the weathered skin of a man who'd spent too much time outdoors and the hollow eyes of recent loss. Heard you might have room for an extra hand around here. Frank studied the man while Jake continued sharpening tools nearby, ready to disappear into the woods if the situation turned sour. Walter's clothes were clean but worn. His boots were suitable for hiking, but showed signs of heavy use. Most telling were his hands, soft enough to suggest office work, yet they accepted the mug of coffee Frank offered without hesitation. Depends on what kind of help you're offering, Frank replied. This isn't a charity or a vacation retreat. Everyone contributes according to their ability, shares in the work that keeps us fed and sheltered. Walter nodded as if he'd expected such terms. Lost my job 6 months ago when the company downsized. My wife died 2 years ago. Cancer took her slow and expensive. By the time I finished with the medical bills, there wasn't enough left to keep up with the house payments. Frank recognized the familiar story of late-in-life displacement. Dreams shattered by circumstances beyond an individual's control. What kind of work experience do you have? 30 years in accounting. 10 years before that in retail management. Nothing that seems particularly useful for mountain living. Walter's self-assessment carried the bitter honesty of someone who had recently discovered that professional credentials meant nothing outside the corporate world. Can you learn to swing an axe? Follow instructions on a building project? I can learn anything you're willing to teach. I'm not afraid of physical labor, just never had much opportunity for it. Jake glanced up from his sharpening, catching Frank's eye with a slight nod. The boy had developed good instincts about people during his weeks in the mountains, and his approval carried weight in Frank's decision-making process. We'll try it for a week, Frank decided. See how we all get along, if you can adapt to the lifestyle, if the work suits you. After that, we'll discuss a more permanent arrangement, if it's a good fit. Frank assigned Walter to Jake for instruction in the basic chores, while he focused on expanding their living arrangements. 3 people required a more sophisticated organization than 2. They would need additional sleeping space, expanded food storage, and more efficient systems for tasks like water collection and firewood processing. The cabin extension Frank had planned for an eventual need became an immediate priority. Using techniques refined over months of mountain building, he began framing a 3rd room that would give Walter a private sleeping space while maintaining the common areas that made the arrangement workable. Walter proved surprisingly adaptable, despite his lack of outdoor experience. His soft hands quickly developed blisters, then calluses, as he learned to split firewood and haul water from the creek. His desk jockey stamina improved rapidly under the demands of physical labor at altitude. More importantly, Walter brought organizational skills that improved their overall efficiency. He established inventory systems for their supplies, created schedules for rotating responsibilities, and suggested improvements to their food preservation techniques based on research he'd done before leaving civilization. Jake seemed to relish his role as a teacher, patiently explaining the wilderness skills he had so recently learned himself. Frank watched the boy's confidence grow as he demonstrated the proper technique for using an axe and shared his knowledge of identifying edible plants. Teaching others reinforced Jake's own learning, while also granting him a certain status within their small community. The welcome sign found its permanent place beside the path leading to the meadow, marking the transformation of a desperate hideaway into an intentional community. Frank realized he was no longer just a man hiding from personal failure, but someone who had created something of value, something that drew others in search of a similar refuge. As autumn approached, Frank found himself contemplating the coming winter, with 3 other people depending on the preparations they had made together. The responsibility felt different from his earlier concerns about solitary survival, heavier in some ways, but also more meaningful than anything he had accomplished in his former suburban existence. The communal pot had begun its life as a restaurant stockpot, abandoned at a campsite by tourists who had underestimated the challenge of hauling gear at altitude. Frank and Jake had salvaged it during one of their supply runs to town, recognizing its value for feeding multiple people efficiently. Now, it simmered constantly over the fire, holding stews that stretched their ingredients to nourish their growing community. Winter arrived early and harsh, trapping the four residents in their mountain sanctuary for weeks at a time. In addition to Walter, they had welcomed Rosa, a woman in her 40s who lost her apartment when medical bills consumed her savings, and Martin, a veteran whose disability checks couldn't cover both rent and medication in the valley's inflated housing market. The expanded cabin provided adequate shelter, but personality conflicts tested Frank's leadership skills daily. Walter's methodical approach to chores frustrated Martin, whose military training emphasized speed and efficiency over careful planning. Rosa's attempts to organize cooking schedules clashed with Jake's teenage resistance to adult authority from anyone but Frank. "We need to establish clearer rules about personal space and shared responsibilities," Walter announced during one particularly tense dinner. "This isn't sustainable if everyone just does as they please." "Rules are fine," Martin countered, "but they need to make tactical sense. Some of the systems we're using are inefficient and potentially dangerous." Frank listened to the debate as he stirred the evening's stew, recognizing the growing pains that came with individuals learning to function as a group. Each person had arrived carrying their own traumas and defensive habits, which had served them well in solitary survival, but complicated communal living. Christmas Eve brought the first true test of their ability to celebrate together, rather than simply endure together. Frank had suggested they mark the holiday, despite their limited resources, believing that shared traditions could help forge their group of refugees into something resembling a family. Rosa contributed her grandmother's bread recipe, which could be baked in a Dutch oven over hot coals. Walter used his organizational skills to plan a feast from their stored supplies without compromising their winter food security. Martin carved wooden ornaments with a surprising artistic flair, creating decorations that transformed the utilitarian cabin into something festive. Jake seemed uncertain about participating in the holiday festivities, his experience with family gatherings apparently soured by memories of his stepfather's alcohol-fueled rages. Frank made sure to include the boy in the preparations without pressuring him to show an enthusiasm he didn't feel. The communal pot held their Christmas dinner, a venison stew enriched with vegetables from the autumn harvest and seasoned with herbs Rosa had foraged and dried during the warmer months. The meal represented collaboration, not charity, with each person contributing according to their abilities to create something better than any of them could have managed alone. "I want to say something," Martin announced after they had finished eating. "6 months ago, I was sleeping in my car behind a Walmart, choosing between medicine and food most days. Tonight, I'm sitting in a warm cabin, surrounded by people who've become my family, eating better than I have in years." "We all walked hard roads to get here," Rosa added quietly. "But I think Frank showed us that losing everything doesn't have to mean losing hope." Frank felt a familiar discomfort with the praise, knowing his own journey into the mountains had been driven by desperation, not altruism. "We showed each other," he corrected gently. "We showed that people can build something worthwhile when they work together toward common goals." The conversation continued late into the night, fueled by a bottle of whiskey Walter had carefully saved and the warmth of genuine human connection. Stories emerged that no one had shared before. Rosa's battle with the cancer that had ruined her financially, Martin's struggles with PTSD and inadequate veterans services, and Walter's solitary grief after the death of his wife. Jake gradually contributed his own story, describing years of tiptoeing around his stepfather's unpredictable violence. Frank realized the boy had never experienced a peaceful family gathering, had never known adults who resolved conflicts through discussion instead of intimidation. Snow fell steadily outside the cabin, muffling all sound and isolating them from the outside world. But inside, warmed by the fire and human companionship, Frank felt something he hadn't experienced since the early years of his marriage: the profound satisfaction of belonging to something greater than individual survival. The communal pot would simmer again tomorrow, and every day after, through the long winter months. But on this night, it had served a different purpose: gathering them around a shared meal and forging bonds that would sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. As the evening wound down and people prepared for sleep, Frank realized his mountain refuge had become something he had never planned for, but desperately needed. A place where broken people could heal while helping others do the same. The medical kit had grown organically over months of mountain life, assembled from scavenged first aid supplies, herbal remedies Rosa had learned from her grandmother, and medications that various members of the community had contributed from their personal stashes. Frank kept it organized in a metal ammunition box, which protected the contents from moisture, but remained easily accessible during emergencies. Martin's cough began as a minor irritation during a February cold snap, but 3 weeks later, it had developed into something that worried everyone. The veteran's breathing grew labored, accompanied by a fever their makeshift treatments couldn't break. His military stoicism prevented him from admitting the severity of his condition until he collapsed while hauling firewood. "We have to get him to a doctor," Rosa declared, pressing a hand to Martin's forehead to gauge his temperature. "This isn't something we can treat with herbal teas and rest." Frank faced the decision he had dreaded since founding their mountain community. Taking Martin to town meant exposing their entire group to official scrutiny, potentially triggering investigations that could destroy everything they had built. But allowing someone to suffer from a treatable illness violated every principle that had guided the community's development. "Walter, you and Rosa start packing what we'll need for a trip to town. Jake, help me get Martin into some warm clothes." Frank's tone left no room for debate. "We're taking him to the emergency room." Whatever the consequences, the journey down the mountain tested everyone's endurance. Martin's condition had deteriorated to the point where he needed help walking, forcing them to make frequent stops to rest during the hike to the hidden truck. Frank had kept the vehicle in working order for exactly this kind of emergency, but he had hoped he would never need it. At Grand Junction Regional Medical Center, Frank faced questions he couldn't answer honestly without exposing their living situation. He provided Martin's real name and veteran's ID, but claimed they had been camping together when the illness developed. The admissions nurse seemed skeptical but focused on the medical issues. Martin was diagnosed with pneumonia, requiring immediate treatment with antibiotics and several days of hospitalization. The doctor explained that his compromised immune system, weakened by chronic stress and inadequate nutrition, had allowed a minor respiratory infection to escalate into a life-threatening condition. "He'll make a full recovery with the right treatment," the doctor assured Frank. "But this could have been fatal if you'd waited much longer to bring him in." Frank spent the night in the hospital waiting room, wrestling with the implications of Martin's illness for their community's future. If one person could develop a serious health problem, others could face similar crises. Their mountain isolation, which provided healing and refuge, could become a death trap if medical emergencies arose. Rosa and Walter had taken a room in a cheap motel, using their precious cash reserves to maintain the cover story of a camping trip gone wrong. Jake remained hidden in the truck, terrified that hospital staff might recognize him from missing person reports and trigger the involvement of social services. The next morning, unexpected visitors appeared in Martin's hospital room. Sheriff Santos arrived accompanied by a social worker, whose presence immediately raised Frank's defensive instincts. The sheriff's expression suggested professional concern rather than hostility, but Frank braced himself for the confrontation he knew was finally coming. "Mr. Morrison, We need to discuss the living situation you've established up in the National Forest, Sheriff Santos began. Martin's medical records indicate chronic malnutrition and health issues related to exposure, consistent with long-term outdoor living. Frank met her gaze directly. Martin's health problems began long before he joined our community. If anything, we've significantly improved his nutrition and living conditions. That may be true, but the situation raises questions about the safety and well-being of everyone involved, the social worker said, consulting her tablet, clearly prepared with information on the group. We've identified Jake Parker as a minor living without proper supervision, Rosa Martinez as someone with ongoing medical needs, and Walter Thompson as an elder potentially vulnerable to exploitation. Exploitation? Frank's voice sharpened with indignation. We've created a supportive community where people help each other survive difficult circumstances. Everyone contributes according to their ability and receives assistance according to their needs. Sheriff Santos held up a hand to keep the conversation from escalating into an argument. No one is questioning your intentions, Frank. But legally, you're operating an unlicensed residential facility on public land with no permits, safety inspections, or emergency protocols. The social worker leaned forward with practiced sympathy. We are prepared to help everyone transition into appropriate housing and social services. There are programs available for each person's specific needs. Frank looked out the hospital window at the sprawling city below. Its anonymous buildings and busy streets represented everything he had fled when his old life fell apart. To return to that world meant accepting defeat, acknowledging that his mountain refuge had been only a temporary escape rather than a sustainable alternative. The newspaper article arrived with a devastating impact, delivered by a hiker who recognized Frank from the front-page photograph. Homeless Haven: How One Man's Mountain Retreat Became a Community, spanned 2 columns, complete with photos of their cabin, garden, and carefully constructed water system. The journalist had somehow located their position and conducted what she called extensive research into their living conditions. Frank read the article with a growing sense of dread, watching his refuge transformed into a human interest story that emphasized the heartwarming aspects while ignoring the practical realities they faced daily. The reporter had interviewed neighbors in Grand Junction, who described the group as inspiring examples of American resilience and proof that people could overcome any obstacle with grit and determination. "This is bad," Jake said, reading over Frank's shoulder. The teenager understood better than the adults how internet attention could spiral out of control. Once something goes viral, there's no stopping it. Within hours of the article's publication, their isolated meadow began to receive visitors. The first group arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, a family from Denver who had driven up specifically to see the famous mountain community and take pictures for their social media accounts. They treated Frank's sanctuary like a tourist attraction, posing beside the welcome sign and asking intrusive questions about their daily routines. Wednesday brought a more serious disruption. A television news crew hiked up the mountain with professional camera equipment, insisting they had a First Amendment right to film on public land. The reporter shoved microphones at the reluctant residents, while her cameraman filmed their private living spaces without permission. "Mr. Morrison, viewers want to know how you managed to create such an inspiring example of self-sufficient living," the reporter announced with rehearsed enthusiasm. "What advice would you give to other Americans struggling with homelessness and economic displacement?" Frank refused to participate in the interview, but he couldn't stop the crew from filming the exterior of the cabin and garden. The violation of their privacy felt like a physical assault, shattering the peaceful isolation that had made healing possible for everyone who had found refuge in the mountains. By Thursday, offers of help began to emerge, each one carrying unsettling conditions. A religious organization wanted to sponsor the community in exchange for allowing missionaries to offer spiritual guidance to the residents. A wealthy entrepreneur offered to buy a parcel of land where they could establish a permanent intentional community, but under his supervision and management. Each offer, however well-intentioned, represented an interference that would fundamentally change what they had created. Frank realized their success in building a genuine community had attracted the attention of people who wanted to mold it into something more conventional, more controllable. "We need to discuss our options," Walter announced at dinner. "This attention isn't going away, and some of these proposals might actually benefit everyone involved." "Benefit who?" Rosa asked sharply. "The religious group wants to convert us. The businessman wants to own us. And the government wants to regulate us. None of them understand what we've built here, or why it works." Jake grew increasingly agitated as the week wore on, his old hypervigilance returning as strangers encroached upon their sanctuary. "I didn't come here to become someone's poster child for overcoming adversity," he said, his voice tight. "I came here to get away from people who thought they knew what was best for me." Frank understood the young man's feelings completely. The media attention had transformed their mountain refuge from a place of healing into a spectacle, one that drew curious onlookers rather than people genuinely seeking community. Their success had become their vulnerability, exposing them to forces that could destroy everything they had achieved. On Friday, the most unsettling visitor yet arrived. She was a documentarian who wanted to spend a month filming their daily lives for a film about alternative communities in the United States. She offered payment for their participation and promised her film would raise awareness about innovative approaches to homelessness and social displacement. "You don't understand," Frank said, as gently as he could. "We're not performing an alternative life for your cameras. We're just trying to survive and help each other heal from the things that brought us here." "But that's exactly what makes your story so compelling," the filmmaker insisted. "You've proven that people can create meaningful lives outside of mainstream society. The world needs to see what you've accomplished." That evening, Frank called a community meeting to address the situation head-on. The unwanted attention had reached a level that threatened their ability to function as a genuine community rather than a tourist attraction or a social experiment. "We have to decide if we're going to fight to preserve what we've built, or if we're going to let outside forces turn this into something we no longer recognize," Frank said, his voice steady. "Either way, things cannot continue as they are." The eviction notice arrived under the weight of federal authority, its stark language delivered by a forest ranger who seemed genuinely uncomfortable with his mission. The document gave them 30 days to vacate the public lands they were illegally occupying, threatening criminal prosecution if they failed to comply. Frank studied the official letterhead as his community gathered around the morning campfire, the familiar routine suddenly overshadowed by the bureaucratic intrusion. After months of peaceful coexistence with the wilderness, they faced displacement by the very government systems they had sought to escape. "It's because of the media attention," the Forest Service agent explained, his tone apologetic. "The higher-ups couldn't ignore the situation once it became public knowledge. Too many liability concerns. Too many questions about why we weren't enforcing regulations." Frank understood the position of the federal employees, who had to follow policy rather than make decisions based on individual circumstances. The very publicity they had hoped might help their cause had instead triggered the exact official response they had always feared. "Officer, we've kept this site better than it's been cared for in decades," Frank argued. No environmental damage, no fire hazards, no impact on wildlife or water sources. Surely that counts for something in your assessment. I agree with everything you're saying, the ranger replied. But the regulations exist for reasons that go beyond individual compliance. If we allow one unauthorized settlement, we have to allow others, and some might not be as responsible as yours has been. Jake stepped forward with the coiled posture Frank had come to recognize from when the teenager was struggling to control his temper. So, we're being punished for the potential mistakes of other people? Son, you're being asked to follow the same laws that apply to everyone else, the ranger said, his voice firming. Public lands belong to all Americans, not just those who decide to take up permanent residence without permission. Frank accepted the eviction notice with the weary resignation of someone who had faced numerous legal defeats. Fighting the federal bureaucracy required resources and expertise his mountain community could not possibly muster. But Jake's reaction surprised everyone. Instead of his usual withdrawal when confronted by authority, the teenager seemed energized by the prospect of resistance. We don't have to just take this, he declared. There are legal avenues we can pursue, ways to fight an unjust application of the law. With what money? Walter asked practically. Legal resources require lawyers, court fees, and time we don't have before the 30-day deadline expires. There are advocacy organizations that specialize in cases like this, Jake insisted. Civil liberties groups, homeless rights activists, environmental lawyers, who might take our case pro bono if they think it could set an important precedent. Frank was astonished by Jake's legal knowledge and strategic thinking. The boy who had arrived as a desperate, angry runaway had grown into someone capable of analyzing complex situations and proposing real solutions. Rosa, who had been silent throughout the discussion, now spoke with the quiet determination Frank had learned to associate with her strongest convictions. I think we should fight for this, she said. Not because we have a good chance of winning, but because some things are worth defending, even when victory seems impossible. What exactly would we be fighting for? Martin asked. He had returned from the hospital with improved health, but also a greater appreciation for the benefits of modern medicine. The right to live without permits on public land. The right to operate outside of normal safety regulations, Frank said slowly, organizing his own thoughts as he spoke. We'd be fighting for the principle that people should have alternatives when conventional society fails them. That communities like ours serve a legitimate purpose and deserve legal recognition, not automatic criminalization. Walter, ever the pragmatist, outlined the resources they would need for a sustained legal resistance. We'd need thousands of dollars and months of preparation, even with pro bono help. Then we'll find the money and the time, Jake declared with the certainty of youth. Frank, you built something here that saved my life, and probably saved everyone else's too. That has to be worth fighting for. Frank looked around the circle, watching how each person had changed during their months in the mountains. Jake had evolved from a resentful runaway into a confident young man. Rosa had regained her health and purpose. Walter had found community after losing his wife. Martin had discovered healing after years of struggling with inadequate veterans' services. If we're going to fight this, Frank decided, we need to be smart about it. We need professional legal help, a media strategy that works for us instead of against us, and support from a community of people who understand what we're trying to accomplish. The eviction notice represented a threat to everything they had built, but it was also an opportunity to set a legal precedent that could protect similar communities in the future. The donation box arrived on Frank's doorstep, courtesy of a retired school teacher from Grand Junction, who had read about their legal battle in the local paper. She had organized her church group to collect supplies and cash, delivering it all in a worn cardboard box that had once held copy paper. Frank examined the contents with a mix of feelings: canned goods, camping supplies, winter clothing, and an envelope containing nearly $800 in small bills and change. The generosity touched him deeply, yet it also made him uncomfortable to accept charity from strangers who likely couldn't afford to give it. People want to help, the teacher explained, introducing herself as Margaret Reynolds. Your story represents hope for so many people who feel left behind by the system. They see what you've accomplished, and it gives them faith that alternatives exist. Jake sorted through the donated items with the practical efficiency he had developed over their months on the mountain. Look at this, he said, holding up a legal brief prepared by a law student at the University of Colorado. Someone's researched prior cases on squatters' rights on abandoned public lands. The legal research proved more valuable than the material donations. A network of volunteer lawyers soon emerged, coordinating their efforts through social media platforms Frank barely understood. Constitutional law professors offered expert testimony on property rights. Environmental attorneys provided guidance on sustainable land use practices. Civil rights advocates linked their case to broader issues of housing inequality and social justice. Sheriff Santos visited the camp 3 days later, bringing news that complicated their legal strategy, but also offered a measure of personal support. The county commissioners are split on your situation, she reported. Half of them want you gone because you're violating federal regulations. The other half think you're providing innovative solutions to homelessness that deserve official support. What's your personal opinion? Frank asked, offering her coffee from the ever-present percolator. Personally, I think you've created something valuable that shouldn't be destroyed by bureaucratic inflexibility, she said, accepting the cup. But professionally, I have to enforce the law regardless of my personal feelings. That said, she added, her posture relaxing, law enforcement priorities can be influenced by community pressure and media attention. Walter emerged as their unofficial legal coordinator, using his accounting background to organize documentation and correspondence with the volunteer attorneys. His methodical approach impressed the legal professionals, providing them with detailed records of their sustainable practices and community governance structures. The lawyers think we have a legitimate case based on principles of adverse possession and environmental stewardship, Walter reported during an evening planning session. But success depends on proving that our presence benefits, rather than harms, public land management goals. Rosa contributed her organizational skills to mobilize community support across the region. Her experience with medical advocacy had taught her how to navigate bureaucratic systems and build coalitions among diverse groups with common interests. Churches, homeless service providers, environmental organizations, and veterans groups all voiced their support for the legal challenge. Martin's military background proved unexpectedly valuable for media relations. His articulate explanations of how the mountain community provided healing for veterans failed by inadequate government services resonated with journalists and public officials. Local VFW chapters passed resolutions supporting their right to remain on public land. The most meaningful support, however, came from an unexpected source: other intentional communities across the western states that faced similar regulatory challenges. Frank discovered their mountain sanctuary was part of a larger movement of people creating alternative living arrangements in response to economic displacement and social alienation. We're not as alone as we thought, Jake observed, reading letters from communities in Nevada, Montana, and New Mexico that offered moral support and practical advice. There are hundreds of groups like ours out there. The donation box had become a regular supply line. As news of their legal battles spread, Frank established protocols to manage the incoming resources, ensuring the donations supported their legal defense while maintaining the principles of self-sufficiency that defined their community's identity. He realized their fight against eviction had evolved beyond a simple property dispute into something with broader implications for housing policy and community development. Success could set a legal precedent protecting similar communities across the country. Failure would discourage others from attempting innovative approaches to homelessness and social displacement. Whatever happens with the court case, we've already proven that people can create meaningful alternatives when conventional systems fail, Frank told his assembled community. The question now is whether society will recognize and support those alternatives, or if it will continue to insist that everyone conform to standards that don't work for everyone. The donation box sat by the hearth, a tangible symbol of their connection to a larger community that extended far beyond their mountain meadow. Win or lose the lawsuit, they had already proven that isolated individuals could unite to create something valuable and sustainable. The land use permit arrived in a manila envelope bearing the official seal of the United States Forest Service, its formal language granting them conditional authorization to remain in their mountain sanctuary. Frank read the document 3 times before he could truly accept that their legal battle had achieved what none of them had dared to hope for: official recognition of their community's right to exist. The permit established Mountain Haven as a pilot program for sustainable land use practices on public property, subject to regular inspections and compliance with environmental protection standards. They could remain for an initial period of 5 years, with renewal contingent on their proven success in meeting conservation and community development goals. "We won," Jake said softly, his voice conveying disbelief rather than celebration. "We actually won." Frank studied the permit's conditions, noting the requirements that would formalize many of the practices they had already established on their own. Environmental impact monitoring, waste management protocols, fire safety procedures, and quarterly reports to the Forest Service would transform their informal community into something akin to an official organization. "We've earned the right to stay," Frank corrected gently. "Now we have to prove we deserve it, with long-term success, not just good intentions." Sheriff Santos delivered the news in person, arriving with a wide smile that contrasted sharply with her previous official visits. "The county commissioners voted unanimously in favor of the federal decision," she announced. "They're calling it an innovative cooperation between government agencies and a grassroots community initiative." The permit designated Frank as the community coordinator, a role that came with both the authority and the responsibility to ensure compliance with federal regulations. He would serve as the primary liaison with government authorities, keeping records and submitting reports that documented their environmental stewardship and social impact. Jake's transformation from a teenage runaway into a contributing member of the community had impressed the social workers enough to alter his legal status. Instead of returning him to his stepfather's custody, they arranged for a supervised emancipation, allowing him to remain at Mountain Haven while he completed his education through distance learning programs. "I want to stay here permanently," Jake announced during their celebratory dinner. "Not just until I'm 18, but for as long as this community exists. This place saved my life. It gave me a purpose and taught me skills I never could have learned anywhere else." Frank felt a profound satisfaction watching Jake's evolution from a desperate runaway to a confident young man with clear goals and a realistic plan to achieve them. The boy's decision to stay was a validation that their mountain sanctuary offered something of genuine value, not just a temporary escape from life's challenges. Walter accepted the role of community treasurer, using his accounting background to establish financial systems that would satisfy government audits while maintaining the cooperative economic principles that had sustained them. His methodical approach to record-keeping impressed the federal inspectors, who had expected to find amateur bookkeeping and informal agreements. Rosa became the health and safety coordinator, developing protocols for medical emergencies and preventative care. Her experience with medical bureaucracy proved invaluable in navigating insurance requirements and emergency response procedures. Martin volunteered to serve as the environmental management coordinator, responsible for monitoring their impact on the local ecosystems and implementing conservation practices that exceeded minimum regulatory standards. His military background in logistics and planning translated effectively to managing the complex requirements of environmental compliance. The permit drew new residents, people who had learned of Mountain Haven through media coverage of their legal victory. Frank established a screening process to ensure that newcomers understood the community's values and were prepared for the physical and emotional challenges of mountain life. "We're not taking in people who want to run from responsibility," Frank explained to potential residents. "We are building an alternative form of community, one that demands a higher level of cooperation and self-reliance than most people are used to." The land use permit represented more than legal permission to remain on public land. It validated their approach to tackling homelessness, economic displacement, and social alienation through cooperative development. Other groups across the country began requesting copies of the permit documents to support similar initiatives of their own. Frank realized their success came with obligations that extended far beyond their mountain meadow. They had become a model for alternative community development, proof that innovative approaches to social problems could earn official recognition and support when properly organized and presented. As autumn approached, Frank contemplated the remarkable journey that had taken them from desperate refugees to recognized pioneers in sustainable living. The permit secured their immediate future, yet it also challenged them to prove the long-term viability of their cooperative principles. "A year ago, I was sleeping in my van with no hope for the future," Frank told his community during their weekly planning meeting. "Tonight, we're sitting in a legally recognized, intentional community that has garnered national attention and official support." Sometimes, losing everything is the beginning of finding what you truly need. The land use permit hung in a frame beside the hearth, a testament to a victory won through persistence, community, and the courage to stand for principles worth fighting for. Sarah's letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, 2 years after Frank had driven his van, the Mulgata, into the mountains with nothing but Max and a desperate hope for survival. Her handwriting was still familiar despite the years of silence, the careful script he once loved to see on birthday cards and anniversary notes. Frank opened the envelope by the creek where he had first found Jake's torn backpack, the water still flowing with the same constant song that had welcomed him to this place. Max, his muzzle now gray but his eyes still alert, sat beside him as Frank unfolded the pages that represented the past, reaching out to the present. "Dear Frank," the letter began, "I've been following the news about Mountain Haven and what you've accomplished there. I wanted you to know that I'm proud of what you've built, even if I couldn't be there to help build it with you." Frank paused, watching the sunrise paint their expanded community in golden light. His original cabin had grown into a cluster of structures, housing 12 permanent residents with a communal kitchen, a workshop, and a meeting hall that served as the heart of their cooperative society. Sarah's letter continued with acknowledgments that were years late but carried weight nonetheless. I realize now that leaving during your hardest time was not the support a spouse is meant to give. You needed someone who believed in your ability to rebuild, not someone who ran when rebuilding seemed impossible. Jake emerged from the workshop where he was studying for college entrance exams. At 19, he had become a self-assured young man whose leadership skills impressed visitors and residents alike. "Morning, Frank. Rosa says breakfast is ready whenever you are." Jake noticed the letter in Frank's hands. "Everything okay?" "Just listening to the past," Frank replied, folding the pages carefully. "Sometimes it takes years for people to understand what they were a part of." For better or worse, Mountain Haven had become a model for intentional communities throughout the region. It hosted conferences and research studies that documented its success in sustainable living and cooperative governance. University students arrived regularly to study their environmental practices and social organization, learning from practical experience rather than theoretical models. Sheriff Santos had become a regular visitor and an unofficial advisor, helping them navigate legal requirements and championing their growth as a recognized voice for alternative housing solutions. Her friendship with Frank had deepened over the years, built on mutual respect and compatible values rather than romantic desperation. "The State Housing Authority wants to fund a replication study," she reported during her most recent visit. "They're interested in identifying which aspects of your success could be adapted to other locations and populations." Frank returned to Sarah's letter, reading her description of her own journey in the years since their divorce. She had remarried, moved to Phoenix, and built a comfortable life that provided security, but lacked the purpose she now recognized by observing Frank's transformation alt from a distance. "What you've created," she wrote, "represents a kind of hope I had long since abandoned.